Welcome to the Korea Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Clint Work. Now, Clint is a professor working out of Incheon in South Korea, where he is also finishing off his doctoral research into a fascinating area of South Korean American history that has strangely been ignored in broader academia. This is fundamentally the issue of operational control, OPCON, the dual command between South Korean and American forces. The running concern throughout the relationship between these two countries of the presence of American troops and the constant setting of timelines to remove these troops. And where Clint's research really narrows in is on the years of President Carter, the 1970s and 1980s, the No Mun-yeon period, and Carter's abortive policy of troop withdrawal. Now this has become central news again, as it always does in South Korea and America, brought up, as always, by a South Korean president, this time Moon Jae-in. Not long after taking power, Moon quickly announced the need for a handover of operational control, for the South Korean military command to take control of both forces, or at least remove American forces from the peninsula. The details, of course, were not there, but the idea is clear. South Korea is a sovereign nation, a strong, modern country, and the constant presence of American troops and American operational control is something that feels anachronistic and feels almost imperialistic in some ways, which clangs in just the wrong way with memories of Korean history. But a touch on history would find the words of Moon Jae-in simply repeated in the presidents before him, Park Geun-hye, Lee Myung-bak, and so forth. Almost every South Korean president that has ever been in power has at one point or another talked about the need to withdraw these troops, talked about the need to regain operational control, and has set a timetable to do this. That timetable has simply been delayed, that president has left power, and the issue has cycled afresh with the next president. This is a serious strain in South Korean-American relations, and one in which neither political elite seem to have a clear answer for. Now, the deep history behind this, and the complexities of the challenge, is a fascinating area of research, and one in which I'll have to admit I didn't know a lot about before this podcast. I scrambled to do my research, and in many ways, I'm just struggling to keep up with Clint throughout this interview. Clint's research really is filling in a hole in the academic literature here. Throughout the Carter years, and the surrounding challenges and surrounding presidencies, there are a series of moral hazards, a series of driving motivations, and numerous tripwires that have held the process up. But one of the things that does come across here is the amazing contextualization with the present moment. Jimmy Carter came to office talking about the need to withdraw American troops from South Korea. Immediately he was pushed back on by his administration, by the higher ranking military officers, and yet he went ahead, set a timetable, and insisted that the troops be withdrawn. Then, through step after step, through a series of processes, and through pushback and delay from his own American administration and bureaucracy, the whole idea fell flat on its face. There is clearly an analogy here with Donald Trump and the current moment. But rather than get too deep into it right now, I'll let Clint Work walk us through the issue and detail the history and explain these contexts himself. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you want it to continue, please consider donating at the Patreon account attached below, www.patreon.com/Jed Lea-Henry. On that, and without any further delay, this is Clint Work. Clint Work, welcome to the Korea Now podcast.
Thank you for having me, Jed.
So today we're going to be talking through a lot of research that I found in some of your articles online, and a lot of these articles are incredibly detailed, and you have a huge online presence in this regard, but a lot of it comes, at least from what I understand, from your doctoral research. So I think as a first step here, we should get you to introduce that doctoral research, or give everyone a good frame for where we're heading and where you're coming in this discussion.
Sure. So I'm currently in the all but dissertation phase at the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. And my doctoral research centers on the U.S.-South Korean relationship and alliance. And my initial dissertation prospectus and idea was to chart the evolution of the alliance from its foundation to the present day, looking at particular points in time, three cases in particular, to sort of chart this evolution, starting with, of course, the foundation of the alliance in the wake of the Korean War, but even beforehand, the Jimmy Carter period, during Jimmy Carter's abortive troop withdrawal policy, and then more recently during the presidency of Roh Moo-hyun, crossing over with George W. Bush. And I chose these three cases at the time, the first, of course, being the sort of critical founding juncture. The second, the Carter period, presented certain profound uncertainties about the continuation of the alliance and its potential sort of undoing with U.S. disengagement, but that not occurring. And so we saw sort of deeper patterns reconstituted in the wake of Carter's failed policy. And then again, under Roh Moo-hyun, this sort of alliance tension and potential for change, but ultimately the alliance settling down again. And so I was really interested in the institutional stickiness of the alliance, as well as its evolution over time. Having said that, the more research I conducted on these three periods, and the more I thought about the actual writing process, I felt I was spreading myself too thin by doing all three, and instead I decided to center on the middle of them, the Carter period. And another impetus for this was because there's really no definitive, in-depth historical case study of taking Carter's withdrawal policy as its point of reference. You know, Don Oberdorfer's book, The Two Koreas, has a very good chapter on it. And there's a dissertation chapter here or there and a master's thesis, but nothing really in-depth on that specific policy. So I decided I would fill that historical gap. And that is where I currently stand. I'm in the midst of drafting as we speak.
So one of the important things through that period that you're talking about there, and one of the issues that's going to run through, I guess, through the history of South Korea as a modern state is operational control, or OPCON, as it's going to be referred to throughout this discussion, I suppose. So this has become something that's, I mean, in a way, it cycles through and is always in front of the media in some ways, but it has come back to the fore because President Moon Jae-in has, of course, spoken about to regain control of OPCON, and the issue has been revived in this way. So I might get to introduce exactly what that is we're talking about and what Moon Jae-in's declaration, or at least speech, was all about.
Sure. As you mentioned, it's not a new issue. And frankly, the issue of operational control and the politics around it and the history around it is sort of what piqued my interest in the aforementioned doctoral research. Because I saw this, as others do as well, this issue of operational control is sort of a crucial node in the overall political and security relationship, one that really lays bare the fundamental hierarchy, but also stickiness of the alliance. And I guess just a bit of history for your listeners. The issue of operational control actually precedes the existence of the alliance itself. The U.S., near the end of the military occupation period, and before they withdrew their combat troops, which they did in June of 1949, the U.S. retained operational control of the South Korean constabulary and security forces. And the main reason was there were several reasons, but one of them was to prevent any sort of instability in an already potentially unstable situation from touching off a greater conflict. And the U.S. retained this control until its last combat troops were removed, as I mentioned, in June of 1949. And this 1 year period from June of 1949 until the outbreak of the Korean War was the only period in South Korea's sovereign existence where there wasn't a U.S. combat troop presence and where the U.S. did not retain operational control over the South Korean military. As you and your listeners likely know, there was a Korean Military Advisors Group, which was about a 500-person outfit of U.S. military personnel who were helping continue to train the South Korean military at that time. But with the outbreak of the Korean War and various UN resolutions and the creation of the UN command, the U.S. once again, based on the so-called Daejeon agreement between Lee Syngman and the U.S. once again took on the operational control of the South Korean military. And at that time, it wasn't just operational control, it's operational command as well. So it was a much more, I think this is an important distinction to draw, actually. It was a much more comprehensive oversight, for lack of a better term, of the South Korean military. So operational control itself is essentially derivative of command authority, and it's transferred for a specific period of time and a specific mission, and it consists of passing authority to assign tasks to military forces that are already deployed. Operational command is, as I said, sort of more comprehensive, and it involves issuing orders covering every aspect of military operations and administration, down the chain of command, all the way to the lowest combat commander. And during the Korean War, for the duration of the war, MacArthur, initially as the head of the UN command, and later commanders, once he was replaced, held operational command of South Korean forces. With the end of the war and the signing of the Mutual Defense Treaty, this designation shifted back to operational control rather than command. This was an important distinction because it allowed not only for Korean commanders to still be commanding their troops, but it allowed a certain degree of space for, and I've written about this in some articles, for Lee Sik-man and later South Korean presidents Park Chung-hee and Chun Doo-hwan to carve out their own sort of command space for domestic political purposes. But the key condition for the Mutual Defense Treaty was this operational control node, and it was included in what's referred to as the agreed minute to the 1954 U.S. South Korean Mutual Defense Treaty, and it was a key condition for the U.S. retaining its military presence on the Korean Peninsula. They wanted to maintain relative control over Lee Sik-man's potential for escalating the situation, and this was born of their experience during the Korean War and his pulling some frontline units back from the front lines to help him bolster and solidify his own domestic political rule in Busan in 1952, and also his efforts during the final negotiation period to sort of disrupt the final armistice settlement by releasing large numbers of communist prisoners in the South and threatening to continue to march north, so to speak. And so the U.S., they wanted to clamp down on any of this moving forward. And of course, Lee Sik-man, South Korea remained essentially abjectly dependent on the U.S. security presence. So he was willing to accept this concession, essentially a concession of his state sovereignty, to retain the U.S. presence.
So that concession there, when it was first announced, as you mentioned there in 1948, before the Korean War, it was intended, at least from my understanding, to be a temporary measure. As you said, it's a surrender, or at least to a degree, of a nation's sovereignty. And when it was surrendered by South Korea, it was designed to be a temporary measure, but it has lasted until now, of course. So why is it such a long-lasting, sticky issue? Why won't it go away on the ground here? So why are we still living with operational control today?
Sure, yeah, and that's the question. It's even the U.S. presence itself was supposed to be temporary. Theoretically, it was, as the South Korean military advanced and developed its capabilities and took on more missions that were passed off from the U.S. and more frontline roles, the U.S. would gradually withdraw and ultimately remove all of its forces. But of course, as you said, they remain to this day, and operational control remains in the hand of the U.S. I think one of the reasons that it remains to this day is really embedded in that initial rationale that the U.S., if it's going to remain committed to the situation through the political commitment of the Mutual Defense Treaty, and to have a substantial number of forces still stationed on the Korean Peninsula, and to this day it's about 28,500, depending on rotational deployments at any given time, that if they're going to retain that political commitment and that presence, there's been a desire to maintain, as I say, this sort of relative hold over the local environment. And it's ironic in part because it's sort of geared to prevent ever having to answer that commitment. And what I mean by that is they want to prevent escalation to the point of all-out conflict. So by retaining, I think the belief is by retaining that sort of relative control, they can keep deterrence in place, even though it's a sort of a suboptimal arrangement, and prevent any conflict from touching off. And of course, the reason that nothing's changed, there are other actors involved. And the militarized Korean division is an immensely complex issue and one that doesn't have a ready solution. And despite the fact that it's been sought for decades now, until there's some sort of larger settlement and some sort of peace treaty or a non-aggression agreement that can replace the current armistice setup, it's very hard to disengage from what, as you said, was supposed to be this sort of temporary transitional arrangement. So what was supposed to be temporary has turned into this semi-permanent, indefinite presence and arrangement.
So you took us up there until that Minute Agreement in 1954, and but as we move forward into the 1970s, something fundamentally changes here, and it's the United Nations and some of the tensions and challenges evolving inside the United Nations that brings about this change. So let's talk us through the 1970s period and what happens.
Sure. And I've written a bit about this. Up until the creation of the Combined Forces Command, which is the current bilateral, binational command structure, and I'll sort of get to that in a moment. Up until that, the creation of the CFC in 1978, the defense of South Korea was under the auspices of the UNC, the UN Command, the US-led UN Command. And under this arrangement, the US held essentially unilateral operational control over the South Korean military, with the exception of certain commands that Lee Seung-man and Park Chung-hee created for internal political purposes. But in the late 60s and early 1970s in particular, the UNC came under various pressures. One was the replacement of Taiwan with the People's Republic of China on the Security Council, and their pressure within that context to not only overturn resolutions that had deemed them an aggressor during the Korean War, but to get rid of the UN Command, which they viewed as, understandably from their perspective, a biased party in any sort of ultimate Korean settlement, because the UNC had itself been one of the co-belligerents in the Korean War. There was also, through this process of decolonization internationally, the emergence of many new nation states and entry of those states into the UN General Assembly, a lot of which took decidedly non-aligned positions and even anti-American positions. And the UN Command was a symbol which these nations could sort of attack or show support for its dissolution in support of their other third world country and sometimes sort of ally North Korea. And so there were votes, sort of the Korea-related resolutions in the early 70s. The trends were such that the pro-ROK resolution, the number of votes for that progressively declined, and those for the pro-DPRK resolutions gradually increased, sort of undermining the overall political legitimacy of the UN Command. And this sort of came to a head in, I think it was June of 1975, when there were both resolutions received the same number of votes. And these were non-binding resolutions, but the pro-DPRK one called for the full dissolution and immediate dissolution of the UN Command, whereas the pro-ROK one essentially called for the temporary and later dissolution of it, provided some sort of institutional peacekeeping mechanism could replace the armistice agreement. So in this context, and also in a context of increasing South Korean military capabilities, U.S. strategists in the State Department and National Security Council, they saw the writing on the wall, and they realized that this arrangement that essentially had been untouched since the end of the Korean War needed to be adapted and altered to changing conditions, not only within Korea, as I said, with South Korea's own enhanced capabilities, but also because of this international context. And so as early as 1973, and I chart some of this in my dissertation, there's internal discussion about the need to transform the UN command, look for replacements to the armistice agreement itself, but also create a military command separate from the UN command and transfer the defense of South Korea from that to a more bilateral U.S.-South Korean alliance arrangement. I think we also have to remember that it was at this time that, in the context of the Guam or Nixon Doctrine and the withdrawal of the 7th Infantry Division in 1971, alongside this, a bit of U.S. disengagement and removal and redeployment of some of its forces on the Korean Peninsula, the U.S. was encouraging and essentially helping facilitate South Korea's own defense modernization. And of course, Pak himself was exuberantly pursuing what he referred to as self-sufficiency. So there was a distinct need to create a command arrangement that reflected South Korea's capabilities and also the need to begin to transfer some missions as the U.S. made more flexible its commitment in this early 70s era.
So let's walk us forward a little bit more here. So we're coming towards the Carter era, which of course, as you mentioned, is a core aspect of your research. But we're just going to hold that off until the end of the talk here. So it is coming for everyone listening. But okay. Let's move into this fascinating moment for the OPCON control and the presence of American forces in South Korea, which is the Gwangju Massacre. And of course, for many people, this is this pro-democracy uprising that happened in South Korea and a strong military crackdown. But this becomes a fraught problem, a challenge for American control, because in some ways it seems as though that the South Koreans violated the agreements of the dual command. At least I'm not sure about that. And there's a lingering feeling in South Korea that America maybe should have intervened to stop the crackdown. And maybe there's also there is a lingering assumption in South Korea that maybe America were actually behind the crackdown because of this OPCON control.
Sure. This is, and when we talk about the current, present day political salience of this issue, as highly technical an issue as it is when we talk about command architecture and how it's passed off at what point in time and what that means for who commands which units and how a war is directed. Aside from this highly technical aspect of it, it's a highly political and symbolic arrangement. And this is born not only of the earlier history I spoke of, but really, as you said, because of the Gwangju uprising and massacre and the feeling. And there's sort of a spectrum of thoughts on this and beliefs, but the belief that the U.S. was at the very least complicit in Chun Doo-hwan's violent crackdown and massacre of the citizens in Gwangju, or much more actively involved. And it revolved around operational control, essentially releasing certain units, certain South Korean units, that is, from the CFC to go down to Gwangju and do what we all know they did, which was brutally murder citizens in the city of Gwangju. I think one of the deepest dives on this to this point, and somebody who's worked very hard to get documents released, is Tim Sharrock, who most of your listeners should be familiar with, and if they're not, they should certainly look up his work on this. Tim and other people who tend to agree with his depiction of events hold that it was more towards the latter of the two interpretations that I just mentioned, that the U.S. wasn't just necessarily complicit, but was more actively involved and sort of knew what was going on, that they helped release, or they agreed to the release of the 20th South Korean Infantry Division, that they knew the special forces were engaged in Gwangju, and that the special forces, because of the nature of their training and what they're normally supposed to be used for, were going to be particularly brutal in their methods, that the U.S. was aware of this. I tend to agree with that. I think the evidence does show, obviously, that at the time I can't remember his name at the moment for some odd reason, the commanding general of the U.S. Wickham, did agree to the removal of the 20th Infantry Division. But it was something that was done. It was sort of a fait accompli in that the division was already on the move. And the South Koreans, I think, did this as much to tie the U.S. into the events for their own propaganda purposes, to sort of defray some of the criticism they might receive, as it was any sort of deliberate U.S. desire to see this crackdown occur. But the evidence that we do have, and we're still waiting on the release of some documents, and I know Tim is working diligently on this, the evidence does indicate the U.S. was aware of what was going to happen, and that heads were going to be cracked. And above all, the U.S. concern was that stability be maintained. So I would not personally go so far as to say the U.S. commanders and Ambassador William Gladstone at the time wanted people to be massacred, or were fully aware that they would be treated in such a brutal fashion and welcomed that. I don't think that's accurate at all. But there is no doubt that the U.S., and this was a long-standing concern of U.S. policymakers, that stability be maintained. And I think we also have to put, and Tim and others do this, put the U.S. thinking and decision-making at that point in context. This was, again, late in the Carter administration. This was after his troop withdrawal policy had effectively been canceled. It was delayed for official purposes, but essentially canceled. In the wake of the Iranian Revolution, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So there was a sort of a notable, significant amount of international instability, a second oil crisis. So to have another area of instability in Northeast Asia, which itself, of course, is a region, a part of the region that's fraught with considerable geopolitical and strategic importance, was sort of loath for U.S. policymakers. They didn't want to see another unstable situation, and particularly another important U.S. ally and alliance particularly fray and fall apart. So the impetus was on maintaining the status quo, stability as much as U.S. policymakers and officials of the embassy were displeased with Chun Doo-hwan and Roh Tae-woo's sort of rolling coup over late 79 and 80. And during that period, consistently stressed retaining South Korean forces under CFC control and trying to stem any fallout from the abuses that could result from martial law. So there's this sort of balance that the U.S. tried to maintain with not seeking and welcoming internal crackdown, but knowing that it was likely to happen, and that if it needed to happen to maintain stability, so be it. And in a sense, they welcomed that, but also not wanting to see that crackdown go so far that itself would lead to a sort of cycle of greater uprising and instability. So they're trying to toe this line, and they're going to lose if they do and lose if they don't, essentially, if that's clear.
Yeah, no, it does. It comes quite well. Let's expand this just a little bit here. So one of the actor that we haven't mentioned much so far in this, and the important actor, I suppose, is North Korea. And one of the challenges and one of the problems brought up by operational control is North Korea and the issues around that. Now, it seems common sense in some ways that operational control gives a certain benefit to South Korea and to America in regard to North Korea. But there's also been this phenomena come about recently, and not recently, it has a deeper history of this, where whenever Pyongyang comes to the discussions, though it's not happening this time, they tend to dismiss South Korea, and they dismiss them on the grounds that you are just an American lackey. You don't have control of your own government. We might as well just talk to the Americans. And this has been one of the forces, one of the issues in which Moon Jae-in wants to regain control, and my previous presidents have wanted to regain control. So let's take us there. Let's take us to North Korea and the challenges with that for a second.
Sure. And this could easily veer off into a deeper discussion of the colonial period in history and how this sort of war for inter-Korean legitimacy was born, and the different historical perspectives it's rooted in. So I'll try not to do that. And I know some of your other guests have done a very good job of that. But as you mentioned, North Korea, in its official state propaganda, and they've been explicit about this over time, has viewed South Korea essentially as the illegitimate other, and vice versa, for that matter, particularly among more conservative South Korean political parties. And one element of that is, they're essentially subservient to, subordinate to the external imperialist American power. And the operational control issue sort of cuts to the core of that. And as I mentioned before, that's one of the things that interested me, was that it does sort of cut to the core of the hierarchy of this relationship. The North Koreans argue essentially that, as long as you are subordinate and subservient, and the U.S. And this goes beyond just OPCON, just the U.S. presence itself, as long as you're dependent on this security presence and nuclear umbrella, you are not an equal with us, and we'd rather not speak to you directly. We'd rather speak directly to the Americans. And so part of the desire to, again, as you alluded to, for the Moon administration and the Roh Moo-hyun administration before it in the mid-2000s to take back operational control, and we should be specific, wartime operational control, because there were some adjustments to the peacetime element of it in the early 90s, was to achieve this sort of more equal status, to be able to stand up on their own and to deal with North Korea as equals. And so that is, I think, undoubtedly part of the political and sort of symbolic thrust behind the more progressive South Korean administration's effort to take back operational control is that whole inter-Korean dilemma, relations, battle for legitimacy. That is certainly part of it.
So let's talk through, let's pretend for a moment that Moon Jae-in gets his way, at least in principle, or a president thereafter gets their way and actually manages to change the fundamentals of this OPCON control. So you mentioned in one of your articles here that there are two options for this, and both are fraught in their own particular ways. So the first option you mentioned is that you simply change the structure of this, that there are two separate commands, the equal and the complementary. And the second option that you put forward is that you flip it on its head, that the same type of command exists, but it's Koreans in charge and not Americans. So let's talk us through those two options there and the challenges that have come up with both of them.
Sure. And I just quickly, before I even get into that, I think it's an important point that another reason for the operational control initially, and as it was born in the Korean War, was just unity of command, which is sort of, and I'm not a military strategist or historian, and I've never served, but it's sort of intuitive, and most people understand it, that if you're going to fight a war, to have unity of command is the most efficient and the most prudent way to fight a war, as opposed to, different sort of equal decision makers making decisions and command decisions in the midst of a war, is obviously fraught with severe risks. So just to have unity of command is one element of this. So as you mentioned, some of the discussions about, well, if we change the current arrangement with the U.S. as the lead command and the South Korean as the deputy, there were sort of two general options, and one was two separate commands, some sort of liaison office binding them, and this obviously undermines that unity of command. And the liaison office and other mechanisms would effectively bind these separate commands, but it would not be the same level of interoperability and sort of sophisticated alliance cooperation that exists under the CFC, which I might add is highly interoperable and highly sophisticated an alliance. That was one option. Another option was essentially to keep the same CFC bilateral command structure in place, but just flip the arrangement from the U.S. in the lead and the South Korea as the deputy to the South Korean commander in the lead role and the U.S. as the deputy. And if you've read the news recently after this year's, and this was just about 2 weeks ago, this year's annual Security Consultative Meeting, or SCM, which is an annual meeting held between the South Korean and American Minister of Defense and Secretary of Defense and other high-level military officials. They decided on, they agreed to and signed a strategic guidance to move forward with the latter of those two options, which is to say maintaining essentially the CFC in place, and they've used explicit language. They're maintaining the CFC, and the South Koreans, if and when this transfer of wartime operational control occurs, the South Koreans would take the lead role and the Americans the deputy position, essentially being then, in the case of a conflict, in the positions the South Koreans would now be if a war was touched off, which is to say under South Korean command. So the CFC would remain in place. It would just be a switching of the hierarchy, so to speak.
Okay, so there is another wonderful issue that comes up through all of this, and you mentioned it throughout your discussions again, that there are two run-in challenges as well, and we're going to get back to some of the deep history in just a second here, but one of the other issues that I find a bit too fascinating to let go here is you mentioned in a couple of your articles that there are two challenges here, and these challenges for both sides. There is the risk of abandonment and the fear of entrapment. So bring us there for a second. Just what exactly are these dual challenges, and what are we talking about here?
Sure. So abandonment, and this is often in the context of the U.S. South Korean alliance. This is a concern. This has been a concern historically of Seoul, of the South Koreans, that essentially their larger and more powerful ally, the U.S., would abandon them because they depend on them for their ultimate security. The fear that the U.S. essentially would, sort of pull up and pull out and leave them on their own. This has been a constant fear of South Korean administrations from really the origins of the South Korean state, and even before South Korea existed as a juridical state. And this drove, in many ways, South Korea's own efforts to bolster its defense capabilities. And this was most explicit under Park Chung-hee and his surreptitious or secretive effort to develop South Korea's own nuclear weapons program and more offensively oriented missile capabilities in the 70s in the wake of the Nixon withdrawal of 7ID and, of course, the end of the Vietnam War. The U.S. was aware of these efforts and put a significant amount of pressure not only on Seoul, but on Canada and France, who were potentially involved in providing reactors or reprocessing technology to South Korea to end this effort. But that concern of potential abandonment sort of has persisted. But what sort of happens over time as the South Koreans have become far more capable than, say they were in the late 40s and the 50s and even 60s, capable in their own self-defense, is a sort of switch where they become, as they're less dependent on the U.S., they become more concerned about entrapment, about being entrapped in a potentially larger U.S. conflict, potentially beyond the Korean Peninsula, and one that comes specifically to mind is something over Taiwan between the U.S. and the People's Republic of China. As you and your listeners likely know, the South Korean economic relationship with China is hugely important. And so they're really loath to have to choose between their longtime alliance partner and Beijing. And so the potential for being entrapped in some sort of other U.S. engagement is a fear of theirs, and that's grown over time. I might also add that where historically DC was somewhat concerned about being entrapped by potentially precipitous South Korean actions, under Lee Sig-man or potentially under Park Chung-hee. There's also been sort of an inversion of that concern of entrapment on the Korean Peninsula, specifically from Seoul's perspective, where, and I think we've seen this a bit under the George W. Bush administration and certainly under Trump, in the 2017 iteration of Donald Trump, where the South Koreans were concerned about a potential conflict touching off here on the Korean Peninsula because of misperceptions and the bellicose rhetoric between Pyongyang and DC, between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. And of course, this is a conflict that they don't see as being in their interest for obvious reasons. So that fear of entrapment on the part of South Korea has grown over time.
So you mentioned China there, and
Yes.
the improved relationship between South Korea and China, and this economic relationship, this growing partnership here. So this brings us to another question, an important question that seems to come up a lot. And that is, of course, recently in the last few years, America has installed THAAD, which are these high altitude defense systems inside South Korea. And of course, not just rankling North Korea, this also upset China an awful lot, which brings us to a question about if you actually do have a withdrawal of troops or a change of operational control or a removal of some of American troops, it'll have to come with an accompanying build-up of South Korean troops. I mean, from most people's understanding, South Korea are not yet ready to take control of their own defense themselves, and they certainly don't have the ability yet to hit a lot of these North Korean missiles. So there is a almost like a hazard involved in this, that if you do seek individuality, if you do seek your own self-control in this regard, what you're also doing is potentially sparking concern in the region, armed races and things along this area here. So what exactly is South Korea's capability at the moment, and what are the dangers involved in a South Korean buildup?
So this is a really important question, and I think there's a lot of misconception around it, because I think, and it's something that I've had to work through myself, that back of this idea is that if the operational control transfer does move forward, and the South Koreans do, take the lead role and develop some of the capabilities necessary, that it essentially portends eventual U.S. withdrawal and the end of the alliance. And technically speaking, it does not. And in a certain sense, operational control could happen tomorrow, because we're still assuming the continuity of the Combined Forces Command, and all of the same capabilities that exist today would still exist tomorrow, which is to say those that the U.S. and that the South Koreans respectively bring to bear. And so with the transfer of operational control, the U.S. is still here, and all the capabilities it possesses, from missile defense capabilities and its high-end surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities, those are still in place, and they'll still be used were armistice to, were deterrence to fail, so to speak, and wartime conditions to arise. All those same capabilities are there, and the alliance would be working together today just as they would tomorrow if OPCON transfer occurred. So in a certain sense, the capabilities are already there, because we're talking about alliance capabilities, not individual country capabilities. Having said that, one of the reasons, and as I mentioned before, I've looked at the Nomuhyun period in some detail, one of the reasons that OPCON transfer had to be essentially the can kicked down the road in the mid-2000s and around 2010, where they kept pushing back the date indefinitely, was because South Korea needed to develop certain capabilities. And these had more to do with command and control capabilities. Sometimes, and I've referred to this in my writing, as C4, ISR, command, control, computers and communication, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities. South Korea do still depend on the U.S. for key high-end surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities, and also higher-end missile defense systems. But again, the question of taking back OPCON isn't necessarily a question of South Korea needing to have these capabilities itself. It's only a question of that if South Korea wants to take on full and sole defense of its country, which would mean the U.S. presence no longer being here. So I think that's an important point. And again, it gets more to the technical defense capability side of the issue rather than the political, symbolic, sovereignty-oriented significance of it.
Well, let's move back to some of that political sovereignty issues here. So, and to the core of some of your research, of course, as you mentioned at the start, Jimmy Carter. And of course, we brushed over him almost entirely at the start. So let's go back and really flush out this era and the challenges that came up. So there are some parallels that people are seeing at the moment between Jimmy Carter and Donald Trump. I mean, there are not many, I suppose, but there is one in this regard that Jimmy Carter came to power on a promise that he was going to remove American troops from South Korea. And people see the same thing being envisioned in Trump. So there's an important thing there, I suppose. So let's take us to those early years. What was Jimmy Carter's idea in removing American troops?
Sure. So one of the things that I'm doing in my dissertation, and I'm literally doing this as we speak, is contextualizing Carter's policy, because it was criticized at the time and historically since as this sort of impetuous, ignorant, not really well thought through policy. And in a certain sense, this is true. The way that Carter attempted to implement it very quickly upon entering office. But in another sense, it's really inaccurate because really starting in the late 60s after the Pueblo incident, and certainly with Nixon and the Guam Doctrine, U.S. strategists in the State Department, on the National Security Council, in the Nixon and Ford White Houses, there was this sort of rolling fits and starts reassessment of U.S. Korea policy, a key element of it being the presence and role of the remaining U.S. forces. What are we going to stay? Are we going to go? What are we going to do? And if we're going to disengage a little bit, how so? What units will we remove? How will we orient those that remain? And so this was an ongoing discussion. And obviously in 1971, Nixon went so far as to remove one of the two remaining divisions, the 7th Infantry Division, which at that time was the more reserve of the two remaining divisions, leaving the 2nd Infantry Division in place. Although at the same time, as part of those removals, they did draw back the 2nd Infantry Division to the forward edge of the battle area, essentially like the edge of the front line, but not up on the front line itself. So there was even a redeployment of the remaining troops. And discussions and potential planning for further removals continued under Nixon and Ford, and Nixon's one of his Secretary of Defense, Melvin Laird, was a key proponent of removing all U.S. forces. And in fact, even in the wake of the removal of 7ID, he had directives within the Army to continue planning for removal of, 1, 2, and then all the brigades of 2ID eventually. So the plans were, even under Nixon, there was discussion and internal planning for removal of remaining troops, remaining ground forces, that is. So when Carter entered office, when he was campaigning and talking about removing U.S. troops from South Korea, it wasn't a novel idea. He wasn't the first person to bring it up. It was something that was occurring, as I said, in internal discussions and was publicly flouted by a lot of people. And it also tied into the other element of Carter's policy, which was human rights and his essentially disgust with Park Chung-hee's Yushin system and the rampant human rights abuses under Park. So Carter's idea of sort of withdrawing U.S. troops in this post-Vietnam environment, of making more flexible the U.S. commitment out of fear of another massive Asian mainland war, sort of quagmire, but also his desire to no longer support this sort of dictatorial government, it reflected a pretty outspoken strain of thought within the U.S. Congress, particularly within the Democratic Party, or a large slice of the Democratic Party, the sort of new internationalist view of U.S. foreign policy, again, which was deeply informed by the Vietnam experience and was increasingly incorporating human rights into U.S. foreign policy making. And of course, this was at a time of just increased U.S. congressional assertiveness anyway, with the War Powers Act and the Angola Resolution. Not only were these views in Congress more robust, but the institutional mechanisms with which to implement them and to actually, rather than just comment on and hold hearings on U.S. foreign policy, but actually influence the implementation of foreign policy, that congressional power was growing. So Carter came and campaigned on this platform of sort of holding POC and South Korean government's feet to the fire a bit more on human rights and even removing U.S. combat forces. He wasn't the only one saying this stuff. I've sort of given a long-winded contextualization of that. But Carter himself, his thinking developed. His initial thinking was to remove all forces, ground and air, at least from what my research shows. But he was rather early disabused of this idea. His idea was to remove U.S. ground forces over about a 5-year period, and even U.S. air forces, and strengthen the South Korean Air Force in the process to give them the adequate capability to defend themselves. And he was talking about this during a trip in the spring of 1975 under the auspices of the Trilateral Commission, which provided much of his own tutorial and many members of his own administration to Japan. And there were various correspondents at the time, and Don Oberdorfer does a good job. I'm not sure if it's in his 2 Koreas, but his reporting at the time, he covers this. Correspondents in Japan and other members of the Trilateral Commission informed Carter of the risks inherent to doing that sort of thing, to enhancing South Korea's air force as the U.S. withdrew, the risk that it posed for potential escalation, right, and potential precipitous moves by South Korea in response to North Korean provocations. Because it's important to remember, at no point in time during Carter's campaign, when he was talking about wanting to quickly remove U.S. forces, at no point in time did he say the U.S. should abrogate the Mutual Defense Treaty and end the U.S.-South Korean alliance. So even with the withdrawals, Carter still talked about honoring this commitment. So the U.S. was still going to be treaty bound to the defense of South Korea. So the risk of spurring or putting in motion events like bolstering South Korea's air force that could potentially spark an escalation to which the U.S. would be treaty bound to respond was something that sort of Carter was made aware of very early on and already started to signal an evolution in his thinking. Nevertheless, when he was elected, he still moved very quickly to implement his policy. Within a week of entering office, there was a Presidential Review Memorandum issued, Presidential Review Memorandum, or PRM 12 or 13, I believe, which essentially talked about laying out the different options for withdrawal. But the internal marching orders from Secretary of State Cyrus Vance was essentially, we are removing troops, so it's not a question of whether we should or should not, but please tell us how we can do so. So the policy was moving forward. And Carter also, and this is part of the sort of sloppy implementation, there was no real effort to strike a larger settlement to the Korean division or to replace the armistice agreement with any sort of non-aggression pacts or peace treaties, and there wasn't a really concerted effort to consult allies in the process. So,
well, let's touch on that issue there, because it comes up a lot in some of your writing here, that in many ways Jimmy Carter was giving something away that countries like China, this is still Cold War era, of course, countries like China, the Soviet Union, and North Korea wanted, and he was just giving it up willingly without consulting them and trying to get something back in return.
And I guess to maybe draw back the comparison to between Carter and Trump, which is, it's really sort of interesting because obviously in a certain level, and the eye test and what we know about Jimmy Carter and certainly about his post-presidential career, they could not be more different as human beings in the values they hold, in the rhetoric they use. And I'll try not to editorialize anymore because I don't have a very positive view of the current president. But in another respect, particularly going back to sort of their entry into office, there are some similarities. Both were, I think you could accurately refer to them as sort of neophytes when it came to their awareness of U.S. foreign and defense policy. Now, to be clear, Carter was far more informed than Trump ever has been. But even so, foreign and defense issues were not his expertise. And as I said, he got a lot of his tutorial from the Trilateral Commission, of which he was a part starting while governor of Georgia. So he came into office with certain notions and sort of, I would say, sort of sentiments that were very much a response to the Vietnam War, the revelations of, the CIA, sort of rapacious, violent CIA intervention in different parts of the world, and also in a context of detente and sort of what some people refer to as it was the ending of the Cold War and the early certainties of the early Cold War, sort of this conception of a monolithic communist threat. All of this had dissipated. Relations with China were moving forward, rapprochement, all this. So in this context, Carter essentially wanted to to push this forward, and his Korea policy was within this context. And so I think it's important to repeat, and this is a key element of U.S. policy, and it gets back to your question, is Korea is never really a priority in relation to a lot of other issues. It's far down the list of priorities. And certainly North Korea's nuclear program has changed that a bit. It's come onto the sort of mental map of course, the U.S. public, but U.S. policymakers more than before. But historically, it's really not a priority. So for Carter, as you said, what are seen as concessions, for him, the Korean commitment and being wedded, this sort of static forward mainland deployment on the Asian mainland and being wedded to this dictatorial ruler, to him was this anachronistic arrangement that we just needed to disengage from as much as practicable while still maintaining the relationship, because he wanted to get on to more important priorities, fostering relations between the industrial democracies, furthering arms control measures and détente. And so the Korean commitment was seen as sort of a stumbling block to these things, I think, in Carter's mind. And so he was willing to sort of move forward quickly and disengage because these other issues were far more important to him. And so, I don't think it was necessarily seen as making concessions. It was just sort of like, as I said, let's move away from this commitment. And I think in a certain respect, Trump is similar. He doesn't know the history. He doesn't understand the rationales behind the commitment and why it might still be worth keeping. And it's just, we've been here for so long. It costs X amount of dollars each year. This is strange. The South Koreans, they appear to be developed. They can take the reins of their own defense. Why are we still doing this? And so sort of in cursory fashion thinking, yeah, sure, I'll change these arrangements, because neither of them, Carter or Trump, were wedded to establishment thinking, right? I will add just very quickly in response to a particular point you made about sort of making a concession to the Soviets and the Chinese, because after all, this was still was the Cold War, of removing U.S. troops. Evidence indicates actually that the Chinese were not really exuberant about the U.S. withdrawal. They had ambivalent, mixed feelings about it because of, and again, you alluded to this before, because of the spillover effect it might have in the region, potentially touching off not only a further inter-Korean arms race, which was already occurring, but also potentially spur further armament on Tokyo's part, as they would be concerned about the sort of credibility of the U.S. commitment in the wake of a U.S. withdrawal from Korea, and also how this might complicate China's relationship with Pyongyang, and the sort of triangular competition between China, Soviet Union, and Pyongyang, and as they tried to foster a relationship with Pyongyang while Moscow did the same, while Pyongyang played them off against one another. So they were concerned, as others were, about the effect, the spillover effect the withdrawal might have in the region. So they didn't necessarily look at it as a concession.
So one of the in that desire to move forward that Jimmy Carter had, though he thought this was too slow himself, he had this imposed upon him by his chiefs of staff trying to slow him down, but he had a 5-year time scale for this. He wanted it over in 5 years. And this, in my mind at least, adds some context to it, in this idea that you can basically name any South Korean president, and at some point they have set a time scale for the removal of the changeover of OPCON control, and then they have delayed, and then they've set another time scale, and then they have delayed. And one of the things that you put in your writing, and of course this was one of the things that was one of the oppositions against Jimmy Carter, is the important thing here is not to set a time scale, because it's never really going to work. The important thing is to set conditions, and when those conditions are met, we can change over.
Yeah, this is a really important point. And so one of the things, sort of shedding some more light on the Carter case that I'm attempting to do, is I'm sort of process tracing through the policy from its origins and the obstacles it faces to its eventual cancellation. And there are sort of two levels of analysis. There's the immediate reasons for its obstruction. And there's sort of two main reasons that it's first delayed and then ultimately sort of canned. And the first is that a key condition of the withdrawal was the passage in Congress of a significant military assistance package, not only transferring a lot of material and armaments from the USFK forces that were departing to the South Koreans, but also increased foreign military sales and military credits to the South Koreans. So this had to pass in Congress, and because of an assortment of opposition within Congress, this legislation was delayed. And as a result of its delay, Carter had to delay the first phase of the withdrawal. In 1978, they were going to remove one whole brigade. There were about 3 brigades in the 2nd Infantry Division at the time. They were going to remove the 1st brigade in 1978. But what ended up happening because of this delay in the legislation is they pushed that first phase of withdrawal over into 1979 and only removed 1 battalion by the end of 1978. This actually ended up being the only significant withdrawal of Carter's administration, in addition to some other missile units that had actually already been scheduled to be withdrawn under Ford. The second salient reason for the Carter withdrawal policy being essentially canceled was the emergence of new intelligence on North Korea's order of battle, showing them to have more artillery, more tanks, more heavily armored units than previously thought, which were more forward deployed than previously thought, and also a larger, just more manpower in their military than previously thought, actually more than the South Korean military. So this intelligence essentially put the nail in the coffin, which it emerged publicly in late 1978 and early 1979, sparking a new internal review of the policy and a concerted effort within the bureaucracy to, as I said, essentially put an end to this policy. These were the sort of more immediate reasons for the policy's delay and then cancellation. But there were other, and this is really what I'm looking at, other deeper background or sort of fundamental reasons for it. And it gets to your point of there's constant setting of timetables, and then no, it's conditions-based, and this constant sort of kicking the can down the road. And one of the reasons I argue this is because there are some deep patterns in the U.S. Korean relationship, and they go beyond the Korean Peninsula. And there are domestic level ones, and I'll sort of put those aside for now because I don't think they're as salient as they were in the early Cold War. But some of them have to do with bilateral issues and stability on the Korean Peninsula specifically. Because at no point in time, and I've sort of mentioned this before, at no point in time has there ever been a discussion in all of these previous timelines and indefinite delays about ending the alliance. So the U.S. is always going to continue to honor its treaty commitment. What that means is it's still wedded to this peninsula. And so there's constant concern that arises at these different points in time, and Carter's policy was no exception, where any changes we make at the local level could potentially spark instability, either because miscalculation on Pyongyang's part about our commitment, leading to more aggressive moves on their part, or precipitous moves on Seoul's part that could spark instability or a conflict, which could set in motion, a series of events the U.S. of course does not view as in its interest. The other, I would argue, even more important and powerful pattern is the significance of the U.S. presence in Korea beyond the peninsula. The most immediate being the security of Japan. And you can see this run throughout U.S. government memorandum and internal discussions and public pronouncements as well, from the origins of the relationship to today. And that is, if you disengage from Korea, it sends certain signals to Tokyo about the credibility of the commitment, and leads to doubts and insecurities that could themselves spur action on the part of other regional actors in Tokyo to bolster their own security, which who knows how Beijing interprets it, how Pyongyang interprets it, how Seoul themselves interprets it, as that relationship is fraught as well, the Seoul-Tokyo one. And so there's concern about the direct spillover effects this could have with Japan. There's also the role that the U.S. Military presence in Korea plays within a larger general military force structure in the Western Pacific. The U.S. presence in South Korea at its origins was considered a sort of strategic liability. in and of itself, because there was no innate value to the Korean Peninsula in the eyes of the US JCS and other military strategists. But as it bore on this larger structure, as sort of a key node in that structure, it was important. And this gets and relates to a larger point of just this sort of nebulous, somewhat infuriating as a scholar, but ever-present notion of U.S. credibility, of a symbol of U.S. staying power. And this, it's sort of hard to pin down and identify. Nevertheless, you see it spoken to throughout the history, that if we disengage, it undermines other people's confidence in our standing, which again can spur these same sort of spillover effects that could ultimately not be in our interest and loosen our control over the local environment, regional environment.
So another important aspect of this, another important, I guess, pre-echo of Carter and the Trump era at the moment, I suppose at least for me, is almost immediately after Carter comes to power, so 3 weeks into his term, North Korea immediately reach out to him. And I suppose they recognize that he is offering this olive branch, even though it's maybe not directed at them, but to remove troops. And you talk through some of the issues in this, and you mentioned that we shouldn't pay. We should see North Korea's game for what it is, and people inside the State Department and the National Security Council were seeing this for what it is, an attempt to reunify the peninsula on North Korean terms. And that's exactly what the outreach is at the moment, and we shouldn't miss this throughout all the talk and all the friendship.
Sure. Yeah, that's. I think you're citing in particular a telegram, a memo from Michael Armacost in the State Department at the time, and yeah, they viewed this as just another attempt. The North Koreans being very flexible in the tactics they employ to achieve larger goals. And Armacost sort of charts these in this memo where we went from the Second Korean War in the late '60s and their provocations, the Pueblo, the EC 121, the Blue House raid and such, to inter-Korean discussions and negotiations, which eventually fell apart, and then a more concerted international effort, and in the UN General Assembly being one part of that. And so here comes along, candidate Carter, and then President-elect Carter, who's talking about South Korea's, Park Chung-hee's human rights abuses and the need to remove U.S. troops. And the North Koreans look at this as an opportunity. And I think it's also important to put it in the immediate context. In the wake of the axe murder incident in Panmunjom in August of 1976, North Korea lost a bit, the wind went out of its sails in terms of its international efforts among the non-aligned movement and at the UN, because it was viewed, the action of the North Koreans at that time were viewed negatively. And so they had lost, at least temporarily, some of that sort of that international support to put further pressure on the UNC and such. And so Carter emerging was sort of, here's an opportunity to sort of recoup those efforts and potentially find I don't know if I want to say sympathetic ear in the White House, but somebody who's willing to consider talking with us and potentially settling things in ways that certainly the Ford administration was not willing to, and previous administrations had not been. But no effort really was made to discuss things with North Koreans. And one of the main reasons for that, and I believe I mentioned this in the same article I think you're citing, is North Korean condition for meeting was we want to meet directly with the Americans, and we won't meet with the South Korean government specifically because they're illegitimate. We want to choose which political parties and groups from the South we meet with. And so, of course, this was something that the South Korean government was never going to agree to. And this sort of request and demand goes all the way back to pre-Korean War discussions between North and South Korea. This demand on the part of Pyongyang we want to talk to a larger assemblage of political parties from the South that we get to decide on. And so the South Koreans, of course, were not going to agree to this. And in the wake of Vietnam, where Pak and other South Korean officials saw the U.S. essentially set aside Saigon and South Vietnam and directly negotiate with North Korea, this fear was even more enhanced. but it was also something the U.S. wasn't willing to do. They wanted inter-Korean discussions to precede anything, and the South Korean government itself to be a full partner in this process. So they were never going to move forward with it. Ironically, though, at the end of, not at the end of Carter's administration, but essentially the end of his policy, when he made this last trip to Seoul, which is documented well in Oberdorfer and other people's work, and had this essentially run-in with Park Chung-hee, who furiously snapped his fingers at Carter and told him he could never withdraw troops. And then Carter had it out with his own advisors in the back of the limousine in front of the U.S. Embassy about his withdrawal policy essentially falling apart. Surrounding this trip, Carter made this last-ditch effort to foster a trilateral, a three-way meeting between the U.S., South Korea, and North Korea. And it was really sort of slapdash and haphazard. It was described as such by people within the State Department, that it was sort of amateurish, not even really worth considering. But these were their marching orders, and they tried to get a third-party country to help negotiate it or mediate over it. And I can't remember whether it was Indonesia or I can't remember the third party at the moment. But this never really moved forward. But it was sort of too little, too late. But it does. There are echoes of that in Trump's own willingness to sort of just at the drop of a hat rush to directly discuss things with North Korea and do so in a way that startles even his South Korean interlocutors who are willing, who brought this invitation to him.
So let's begin, just to wrap this up, with some core ideas and some I suppose some gazing into the future in a way. Now, you've written an article here that I suppose sometimes the titles of articles are meant to be eye-grabbing, but it says U.S. soldiers might be stuck in Korea forever. But I take it from what you've said so far that the actual presence of U.S. troops into the future is not really the issue for you. Is that the alliance remains. So let's just give us, I suppose, a wrap-up of the issues here. This idea that these long-lasting mindsets, these cultural attachments, I suppose, from both sides to the idea of OPCON, to the idea of American troops in South Korea, and how you see this ending up. Do you ever see there being a place in the future, short of reunification, of course, where there will be a withdrawal of troops or a change of OPCON, or is this a can that's just going to get kicked increasingly down the road forever?
Yeah. I mean, that's a tough question. It's one that I think myself and many others are contemplating all the time. And the short answer is, of course, I don't know. But and you're right about the titles. Editorial staffs take some license with those. Whether it was North Korea will never attack the U.S. or U.S. troops will be in Korea forever, it's not exactly reflective of my own view. In a broad sense, the alliance and the U.S. presence here is a historical creation. It came into existence at one point. It evolves. It will eventually dissipate and wither away of necessity. Question is, of course, when and how will that happen? One of the reasons that I address this in the articles that you've mentioned, that the U.S. forces will be here forever, or that even peace won't necessarily eliminate the need for U.S. troops. That's not necessarily my view of it, but it is certainly the view of decision makers in Washington, D.C. and in the Pentagon, because even to this day, they still see the U.S. presence here as deeply embedded in and wedded to larger purposes and a larger strategic tapestry and sort of political psychological tapestry. That despite the enormous evolutions in the region itself, still abides. And I think it goes all the way back to Martin Leffler's idea of American preponderance. The U.S. wants to maintain essentially a preponderant economic and security position. And so it's very hard to disengage from Korea insofar as what effect that disengagement might have on this larger ability to remain preponderant. And this is sort of speaking in very broad terms, but I really don't think we can discount just how powerful that ultimate rationale is, to the point where it's even, I think, even unconscious for the powers that be in DC and sort of the so-called establishment. So I think that makes disengaging and removal of U.S. troops anytime soon very difficult to see happening. Nevertheless, as you've said, Trump, I wouldn't say he campaigned on the issue of removing U.S. troops, but during his campaign, he certainly mentioned his willingness to see that happen. And, it's in this context of, we pay for everything, we do everything for everybody else, we need to take care of ourselves, the South Koreans can do it. And he also mentioned, why don't they develop their own nukes? Why don't the Japanese develop their own nukes, right? These go against what are long-standing tenets of U.S. foreign policy to prevent that sort of proliferation. So Trump could presumably, if, say there is a declaration ending the Korean War, which is a political declaration, it's not legally binding, but it shifts perceptions. It does. If things like that move forward, it's potential for him there is potential for the president to maybe say, okay, maybe let's disengage a little bit. And you may have seen the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dumford himself, said something along these lines quite recently, that assuming agreements like this move forward, an end of war declaration, and then even beyond that, a peace treaty, I think there's no doubt there would be pressure to disengage. And frankly, that's something I personally would welcome, because we're moving into a new era. The caveat to that, of course, is for some that anything North Korea agrees to, you cannot trust. They're doing it for, they still have their larger fundamental purposes in mind. Even I have sort of argued this. And that, nothing is certain. And so there could still be opposition within the bureaucracy to prevent any really notable disengagement. But I honestly, if there are agreements, inter-Korean agreements that continue to move forward, and somehow this process of, I don't even want to call it denuclearization, because there's been no substantive move towards denuclearization yet. And I think it's foolish to say there has been, but they are talking. And there have been historic meetings and agreements, which is sort of what makes the current setting so difficult to prognosticate about, is you have a total lack of actual substance in the so-called denuclearization process. I mean, there are promising signs, but nothing that could easily be gone back on. But at the same time, you do have historic meetings and incredible discussions moving forward. So it's this sort of really contradictory, strange period. So I do foresee, if this process, however you want to characterize it, moves forward, that there could be, and by move forward, I mean, end of war declaration and potentially further agreements, there could be a shift in perception that leads to increased pressures for disengagement that, Trump obviously has already shown a willingness to consider, and that the political pressure and even desire for it on the part of maybe the South Korean government, where we could see that moving forward. Frankly, though, I don't necessarily see that happening anytime soon, because unfortunately, I find it hard to believe that we're going to see any real notable or remarkable change in the current structural arrangements of the peninsula anytime soon. Because I think the U.S. stance on what they want North Korea to do and agree to, and Pyongyang's stance on what it is or is not willing to do, are still very much at odds when we get down to brass tacks. And you can only kick that down the road so long. You can only have these sort of rolling summits so long without ultimately push coming to shove and saying, okay, this is where we stand, this is where you stand. Can we move forward or can we not? And I fear that we're going to inevitably reach that point where we, the lines are drawn, and maybe we return to the sort of status quo ante of deterrence and, the suboptimal situation of ongoing militarized division, which of course we're all very familiar with.
Well, of course, that's a good note to leave it on, I suppose. A bit bleak, but of course very realistic. So this has been fascinating, a great look into the deep history of these issues. Of course, we didn't get to the bulk of your research. There's so much more here to cover, so maybe I'll have you on again one day. But yeah, it's been absolutely enjoyable. So Clint Work, thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
And thank you so much for having me, Jed. It's been very enjoyable.